Hello, everyone. Welcome back to RotoViz Overtime on RotoViz Radio, brought to you by Blue Wire. This is a special draft edition of the RotoViz Overtime podcast. Myself and Shawn Siegele are about to draft in the Best Ball Mania 3 tournament over at UnderdogFantasy.com. It's about to get fast and furious here in a couple of seconds as we get ready to draft. If you're drafting over at Underdog Fantasy, use the code RotoViz. It will get you a 100% sign-up bonus up to $100 when setting up a new account. But Shawn, I haven't been able to see the screen because we're recording the intro here. The league is filled, I believe. Have we got our draft slot yet?
Yes, we are the 102.
I think the key is, Shawn, as we look here at the board, when I'm drafting in Underdog, I can't set up my own account because I'm based in Ireland. I'm co-drafting all these drafts. I'm co-drafting a lot of them at the moment, but I am getting top 4 draft slots in all of these. So maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a bad thing. Maybe that won't serve us well as the season goes on here. But so far, so good. The 102, are we looking at the JT Christian McCaffrey start here again, or are you feeling frisky for some wide receivers here today?
Well, I think that we still have to consider the hyper-fragile approach. I think we want to put some of these drafts out there early before the running backs, and especially the fun young running backs who actually work for this approach, the guys you might actually draft in the dead zone before they get too expensive, which is about to happen. I mean, I've been saying this for a month. We're in that time period where if you've read from Michael Dubner, you know that there are some strengths and weaknesses to drafting now. But one of the things that we have in July is a lack of momentum either direction. But training camps are sort of on their eve currently. We're about to get a whole bunch of new information column, and I think that running backs are going to get more expensive in this half PPR format.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that we are in a flat spot. So I'm going to go Christian McCaffrey, or sorry, Jonathan Taylor here. Unless you want to go Christian McCaffrey, we'll take JT. And I do agree. We have been in that holding pattern over the last kind of 4 to 6 weeks, where little bits of news come out, and we're like desperate to get this news. Once it comes out, we're trying to decipher it, but it's very, very slowly trickled out, whereas we are going to get into a rapid pace of movement, news coming out from beat writers, players. Unfortunately, it always is going to happen. Players getting injured, how depth charts start to shake out, how rookies are doing in camp. It's going to be time to be, checking the news frequently as you draft to get on top of everything that is happening. So I'm excited for that to happen. Both I'm excited and apprehensive, Shawn, because it can become quite hectic as we run through these. But we start off with Jonathan Taylor. Cooper Kupp went at 101 in this. Then it went McCaffrey, then Jefferson, then Chase, then Eckler. Diggs is the next player off the board. Shawn, you're the man pushing these running backs on me so far this offseason, but I think today may be the day that we do a hyper-fragile build. We'll see how it plays out. We have been fortunate enough a number of times that we have seen some of the targets we want to get at the back end of that second round, but let's see how it plays out today. I think we may go for that hyper-fragile approach today.
And one of the things that you'll notice with the underdog format here is that you do have more balance between running backs and wide receivers. You pull up the Win the Flex tool, and you see that if you opt for at least a half a running back in the flex, and obviously you can't play a half a running back, but we're looking at over the course of a season, then the values for the top running backs and the top wide receivers that are implied by ADP in terms then of value of a replacement, you see guys like Taylor and McCaffrey and Kupp are very, very close. So on the one hand, it's not a surprise at all. It's not a bad pick at all for Kupp to go number 1. If we're going to be looking at drafting some of these running backs and taking running backs outside of the dead zone, then I do feel very comfortable taking either Taylor or McCaffrey. Those are really the guys that I want to have exposure to. A few of the other guys we might want to have exposure to would be players like a Saquon Barkley, who just went at the 201. You have an interesting dynamic in Underdog because the value of the running backs with the half PPR scoring, you can see, is very different than in full PPR. The Win the Flex demonstrate this, and yet we still have a lot of these dynamics from zero RB that are going to come into play, right? If you have the breakout running backs, if you have those guys like a Devin Singletary, Sony Michel, or Rashad Penny who score at the end a situation that's much more likely than for your wide receivers. Those guys will win you tournaments. You still have the dead zone in terms of the concern about the upside for those players. So where the win the flex tool might tell you to draft running backs in the dead zone in Underdog, that's still a little bit of a problem, right? So we have to navigate a variety of kind of conflicting information in a very interesting way in this format. That's one of the reasons that I think Underdog has been so fun to play, and just being able to get some different builds. There are some listeners who don't like it anytime we draft anything other than zero RB, but throughout the whole time that we've been talking about zero RB and really back to the beginning, one of the things I've mentioned is I like running backs and I want to draft some. Underdog gives you that chance, and I think that trying to play these hyper fragile formats is a lot of fun. Now, we're into the situation here, Colm, where the top values are Fournette, Javonte Williams, Nick Chubb, but I get the impression you're probably going to push for AJ Brown here.
I'm gonna let you take Javonte Williams here.
Oh,
let's take Javonte.
Okay, so Colm is going in a different direction on me.
I love the way there's just a complete shock when we get some of those running backs on the board. So we'll see how it plays out now. Now, this is a period, Shawn, where I'm interested to see what you think. We have 22 seconds on the clock. ETN would be probably the guy that I would be targeting in this range. James Conner's there is availability. And then we have let's go Pitts or Waller, actually.
Okay, so we have to take Kyle Pitts. This isn't a tight end premium format, obviously, but one of the things that you'll note from Connor O'Driscoll's writing on Underdog, and he's given us 3 just fantastic pieces about how to execute anchor running back, how to execute zero running back, how to execute hyper fragile. And not surprisingly, you look at his work, you look at what Michael Dubner has talked about in terms of the silver bullet approach to best ball. Having that elite tight end is a big part of it. And one of the reasons why I like to get Kyle Pitts here at the 302 is, again, when we're contrasting some of the different formats that we're drafting in, there are things that you can do and values you can get in one format and not the other, as opposed to sort of pressing and reaching for a guy in a format where the price doesn't give you the chance to really win with it. Then simply take him in the other one. Right. And that's what we've done here with Kyle Pitts. One of the things that you'll note when you pull up the Underdog Advanced Rate Explorer, you'll see that these elite tight ends, because of some of the struggles that they had last year, 2021 was not as good a season for elite tight end as the recent past previous to that had been. But even with that being the case, because those elite tight ends have the upside in the playoff weeks that is so important to you, they can have lower regular season advance rates or lower advance rates into the playoffs, but then the teams that do make it through have just such a competitive advantage because they still have tight ends that can now go off for 30 points in the playoffs. The goal for us will be to build a team through with the star running backs and young running backs and then the wide receiver depth to where we do make it through. And that was one of the things that really benefited us last year in the FFPC tournament, is that our team overall was strong enough that when Jonathan Taylor had a bad playoff week, we were able to get him through where a lot of his teams went out. We're going to try and make sure that we get Kyle Pitts through regardless of how good of a season he has. Now, one of the things we're obviously hoping for is that he has a good season and he can be part of making it. And then perhaps different players on our team will allow the diversification, that they will be the differentiators in week 17 to win the $2 million.
Yeah, and Shawn, you mentioned last year, the Jonathan Taylor one, for people remembering back, the first week of the playoffs last year was week 14. Colts had a week 14 bye. Taylor, I believe, and Cooper Kupp may have been the most advanced players in the Underdog tournament to the playoffs. And by the time that week 14 bye happened, and you mentioned the down game, I think there was like 4 teams left, and we were the only Taylor team, I believe, that made that final. But when we looked through some of the options, you were taken aback by the decision that I said to take Javonte Williams. Would Williams have been your pick there, or had you somebody else in mind at the running back position? And you mentioned AJ Brown. At some point, Shawn, I need to differentiate away from my AJ Brown, T. Higgins drafts. I need to change those up to not have 70+%. So were you surprised, and was that the pick?
So Colm has this problem that is the ultimate rich person's problem. of having so many 101 and 102 that he has to get away from T. Higgins and A.J. Brown. One of the reasons I was looking at a potential receiver there is that I like to continue to load up on Breece Hall, Cam Akers, Travis Etienne, J.K. Dobbins. Now that we have 2 running backs, obviously we're probably looking for only a third as opposed to a third and a fourth. We may kind of regret not being able to take some of those guys. But at the same time, you mentioned getting a little bit away from A.J. Brown. I have so much Breece Hall that when he gets injured, it's going to be a very dark day. Colm, we are quickly heading back for the 4-11, however, and a couple picks. He's the top player by ADP, but he's still there. Is he going to make it through these 2 drafters?
I'm going to say he's not going to make it through, but I think for us, he would be a fantastic pick here. He goes as I say that. So he didn't make it back. So we're into a situation where 1 pick away, Deontay Johnson, Jerry Jeudy, and Cam Akers would be kind of the top options in the queue. We already took a tight end, so then Kittle's there. But looking at the other options, you would have David Montgomery, J.K. Dobbins, Josh Jacobs, who we talked about earlier this week, and Elijah Mitchell, who we talked about earlier this week. But Shawn, I think that it's Cam Akers or we're skipping at running back at this point. Is there anyone else that you really want to see here? DK Metcalf's the player in this range that I'm probably drafting the most out of the names that are here.
Well, I think both Deontay Johnson and Jerry Jeudy offer interesting ways to play this. And I mean, Johnson at this price is almost impossible to pass up, but I think putting Jeudy onto this team would also be a cool choice. Do you have a preference?
No, let's go Johnson. We'll see who comes back then. Based on how the ADP was going, obviously the hope is that maybe Jeudy sneaks back to us here, and he does. So we have an option at this point. DK Metcalf's there, Bateman's there, Judy's there. Do you want Jeudy over those specifically with the fact that we already have Williams from the Broncos offense?
Well, let's go ahead and take our shot here at Cam Akers and get this hyper fragile build that we've been discussing. I think there's a possibility that J.K. Dobbins comes back and might be even more dynamic for us. But Colm, again, I have a ton of Dobbins. It sounded like there was a little bit of a dust up earlier this week in terms of Dobbins versus reporting that he would not be ready.
Specifically within Rappaport.
Well, we've seen rumors and reports from a variety of sources suggesting this could be an issue, and his coaching staff has hinted that they want to see him out there, or that they at least want his ability to practice to match up with what he personally is saying. But that's more or less just some of the stuff that happens at this time of the year. Big picture, the Ravens have raved about his recovery. They expect him to be back and better than full strength at some point this season. J.K. Dobbins, off the chart, Jamal Charles-like ability, and in an offense that will be run heavy, but also will be very scoring heavy, which there are some problems with the Ravens in terms of expected points and hitting that legendary level that we talked about on Thursday. And yet at the same time, with the prices that you're going to get on J.K. Dobbins and the potential for multiple 150-yard, 3-touchdown games, it's pretty hard to ignore that. So I like him. We'll see what the health situation is. We have started here with 3 running backs, all of whom we think are big talents. They're young guys. Jonathan Taylor, obviously no questions about. Javonte Williams and Cam Akers should be in offenses that score a lot of points and could be a little bit more run heavy than maybe we would like in some other ways, right? But when you put those 3 backs with an elite tight end and Kyle Pitts, we've got this foundation now that works for hyperfragile. So our goal will be to hit those QBs in the window if we get good values, or to potentially take one elite QB and maybe hit on a couple of these late quarterbacks that we like. But Colin, the main thing now is that we get to take a lot of wide receivers, and that obviously is always fun.
Yeah, this is the part now where we come back up for oxygen and try and fill up our lungs with that fresh wide receiver air. So we'll see how it plays out. Shawn is adding a couple of players to our queue as we're 7 picks away. Could be a little bit of a flat area here, Shawn. We'll see how it gets in terms of the wide receiver position. looking at some of the quarterback options that might be in this range too. Jalen Hurts, maybe somebody who's around here, Joe Burrow. So going to be fun to see how these next couple of picks play out for us. But I'm looking forward, Shawn, to sharing this draft board some point during the week and asking, without the team's names revealed, which roster is ours, because I don't think the good folks out there on Twitter will believe that we together managed to draft 3 running backs at this point of the draft. But I'm excited to see how it plays out, how we continue to move here. 4 picks away. Players going off the board in recent picks have been Amon-Ra St. Brown, David Montgomery, Jalen Hurts, and then Elijah Moore. Some of the players in our queue: DeAndre Hopkins, Drake London, Joe Burrow, Trey Lance. Joe Burrow goes off the board. TJ Hawkinson there as well. Shawn, looking here, there's a couple of players that are the veteran wide receivers that we're not really targeting very much. And when we're looking at those guys, we're looking at Adam Thielen, for example. It feels like we may be in a quarterback zone here for Trey Lance. What's your thoughts on this particular pick? Is there somebody you want to draft ahead of him?
I think that we could look to Drake London already, even though we have Kyle Pitts. It's vaguely intriguing to me to take DeAndre Hopkins here and try and win the whole thing with him in the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, let's go. We're out of time. I haven't drafted DeAndre Hopkins maybe once or twice this year, very, very rarely. And Shawn, let me tell you that my advice is normally that draft him on a roster that already has 4 wide receivers. We do not have 4 wide receivers here, but we will get it to play out. We have another pick coming up rapidly here after 2 more picks. I think Drake London would be the clear pick there, or Lance. Based on the build, Shawn, I think we probably are better to get the wide receiver. But what's your thoughts?
Well, we have this Cardinals-Falcons potential Week 17 shootout. You add London into that. That becomes a way, too, to perhaps play a lesser QB late. But Trey Lance has such massive upside. And as long as we're trying to win the whole thing and we don't have a clear-cut wide receiver who's a no-brainer, I think that I'm okay going with your quarterback here.
Okay, let's go before we run out of time. I have to say the feedback on the time clock watch is people are telling me that they are feeling queasy as they're panicking that we won't get these picks off. So it's fun time. So our roster so far is Christian McCaffrey, Javonte Williams, Cam Akers, Deontay Johnson, DeAndre Hopkins, Kyle Pitts, and now Trey Lance. So there is a lot of upside so far packed into this roster. And London, I think there would be the safer pick, but I do think that we also have the upside of Lance, which I think is the long-term play. We'll probably be looking at a lot of rookie players throughout the rest of this draft to try and fill out the wide receiver position. But I think as we continue to hammer those wide receivers, we will patch together a wide receiver room that we are going to be fine with when we get to the end. So how are you feeling, Shawn, so far? We have a little bit of time before it gets back to us, 13 picks away, as Shawn frantically is adding nothing but wide receivers into the queue at this point, which is perfect. And the dream scenario, Shawn, now, as much as we want wide receivers, TJ Hawkinson remains on the board. If he gets back, we might double up on those tight ends. But how are you feeling so far as we kind of head into the late 7th round here?
Good, because this is a tournament-winning team. It's also a team that could finish lower in its league than most of our teams do. Because of the usual structural approach, it's very difficult to end up with a team that's outside the top 4 or 5. The structure is just too dominant to fall much more. Now, if you have a team that has, say, 40-50% injuries, you can always slide a little bit further than that. You do have to actually have players, and when you have only 18 roster spots, the potential to lose out on some guys is going to come back to haunt you on some teams. This one, with a more running back heavy approach, with the early tight end, with the early quarterback, we have more downside, but the upside is also significant. Again, kind of mentioning the overall structure. And if you haven't read it, it's an absolute must read. Connor's article about hyperfragile in Underdog, how to fix it, demonstrating that one of the reasons why when you pull up the roster construction explorer and look at hyperfragile sort of in a vacuum or without going into the detail, it doesn't seem like it's that effective, but that's because a very large percentage of hyperfragile drafters don't execute the other parts of it that you need to do. And so one of the things that we've been aware of in the early going is to make sure to get that elite tight end, make sure to get that QB in the window. We'll look at a second QB if the opportunity presents itself. Because we've avoided some of the wide receivers early, we do know here that we could actually hit a flat spot at wide receiver to where we actually do want to take a different position. If that happens in a spot where we like a quarterback, we'll take a quarterback. But Colin, one of the things that I like about doing Hyperfragile right now, in addition to some of the values that I think that you're going to get on the young running backs, is that I also think that there are some values on young wide receivers that won't be there later. And so you'll need to be a little bit wide receiver heavy once those guys jump up, and once players like Will Fuller and Julio Jones jump up. There's a chance right now. I mean, there are some pockets of receiver late that I think give you still a lot of upside now. 15 days from now, I don't know if those values will still be there.
Yeah, I think we're going to start to see that. And I think it was on OT that I mentioned this. It may have been on the Best Ball show, but I do think that we're seeing, after the draft, the talk has died down on these rookies, but the rookie hype will skyrocket here once we hit training camp. And I do think that then we'll see those ADPs rise as well. Somebody, Sean, that's not in the queue, I'm just wondering if we want to add him in as well. Sky Moore is an option that would be there by ADP in terms of the wide receiver position. We also have Garrett Wilson in the queue, Tyler Boyd in the queue, Rondell Moore in the queue. So based on where we're picking in one pick, we're likely to get two of those four at minimum. Have you a preference for the four or the two wide receivers that we would prioritize here?
I think perhaps Boyd and Wilson might be the way to go. It's tricky because Wilson, again, you got this very slight chance that he would come back around, but pretty dramatically undervalued. You're hoping that Rondell Moore would come back in the following round and perhaps give you not only the breakout points, but the points from early in the season when DeAndre Hopkins isn't there. What are your thoughts on going ahead and reaching for Garrett Wilson? Obviously, we took Tyler Boyd when Sky Moore was selected one spot ahead of us.
Yeah, I think we go and do it and get him on the roster. I think we're gonna need to challenge ourselves, I think, with ADP in some spots of this draft. One thing to note now, we'll see. We're going to draft lots of wide receivers, Sean, so it won't matter at the end. We have 4 wide receivers. One is suspended for the first 6 weeks. 2 of them have their week 10 buys, but I think we'll be okay by the end of it when things play out. Hopefully, Sean, what we will see is some of those wide receivers that we're discussing at these points as the second option when it's coming back at the 0-2 pick of each round, that hopefully some of those guys may slide back to us in the following round. That would really be a benefit to us. So players that we may potentially be looking at the next turn, just for people listening in, would be Rondell Moore, Kenny Galladay, Jarvis Landry, Jamison Williams, Jamison Crowder would be in there as well. So we'll see if some of them are obviously going to make it by ADP, but Rondell Moore would be the key target for us at this point. Sean, we're talking about the quarterback window as well. Have we any specific targets that you're hoping to implement into this particular build from the quarterback position?
Well, one of the guys that we should have considered and was a potential pick for us in the last slot was Dak Prescott. He had kind of landed at a juncture there where we would have had to have some interest. He actually goes behind Derek Carr and Matthew Stafford in this draft, which is an interesting development. I'm hoping that Justin Fields comes back around. And one of the reasons why I like that is that both Fields and our first quarterback, Trey Lance, can be played without quite as much of an emphasis on trying to pair them up with receiving targets, which is nice because many of the receiving targets of quarterbacks we would work through or work with at this point have already been taken. So we're looking at guys who are either outside the window or players that we don't have the stacks with. One of the things about this hyper fragile build and the uniqueness of it, especially if you execute it in the way that actually works, is that I don't think that we have to have as much of a focus on uniqueness. Now, to have some of the player connections in week 16, week 17 that allow the team to really pop, we're not necessarily avoiding that, but there's the freedom to draft in different ways and to get the receivers who really make sense and can elevate this build. I just really like to have that freedom. And so Justin Fields, someone who has an ADP around 125, I think works very, very nicely for what we're doing here.
Yeah, so we'll see. Hopefully he's another one that will be in contention for us when it does come around to some of these selections. We are 3 picks away, Sean. Rondale Moore still there as an option. The recent picks have been Kenny Galladay, Dawson Knox, Jarvis Landry, Zach Ertz. Ronald Jones goes off the board. So 1 pick away, Sean. If we get the option here, is Ronald Jones the clear pick? Jamison Williams would be the other player, but usually goes about 14 picks after Rondale Moore. And Rondale is there.
So yeah, this is perfect. We get Rondale right about at ADP. We have more of this Cardinals-Falcons Week 17 matchup. I love being able to put that together because I think that Moore is going to score a ton of points early, but I think that he and Hopkins are also going to score a lot of points together. It gives us multiple ways to play that game and just so much overall upside. We are back on the clock. Justin Fields is available here. The other vaguely intriguing pick would be Jamison Williams and continuing to try and stack in some players with just monstrous playoff upside. But Colin, it seems like Fields is probably the pick.
I think we go Fields, and having Fields as well, that's going to give us additional opportunities now to go ahead at the other positions. We'll be set on a 2 quarterback build. There is sometimes when, if we pass there, we have found ourselves a little bit, into those 3 quarterback builds then when we're hoping to do it. So I think that gives us a lot of security at the quarterback position. Obviously, Trey Lance is not the starter yet, but we fully expect that to be the case. Sean, myself and yourself had a couple of season-long rosters last year where we did draft Trey Lance, and obviously we held him throughout the entire season. But the upside is just so immense heading into year 2 here for him. And I like what the option there to have Fields also gives us now at the quarterback position. And we are going to need those extra tickets, I think, later on at the wide receiver position specifically. So it worked out pretty well. Our targets in that range that we really, for me anyway, I was really hoping to get was going to be Fields, was going to be Moore. We get both of those. I also, Sean, we've talked about this on a few drafts, a few shows. I am ending up with a lot of correlations between that Bears and Lions game in week 17, whether it's Hawkinson and Fields and then other players mixed in, whether it's Goff and Hawkinson and then adding in Darnell Mooney, lots of different ways. But that's the game that it keeps going back to. And we joked about it, Sean, on a recent show, but the Seahawks Jets week 17 game is, I have too many correlations with that. It's either Breece Hall, DK Metcalf. I have a team ongoing that I'm drafting over at the FFPC, and you're also in that slow draft where I've DK Metcalf, and I've paired him in now with Geno Smith in the late rounds in the Superflex tournament. So we're having lots of fun with the Seahawks and the Jets. So we'll see how our draft continues here today. But some of those lower cost stacks, I think, are going to increase in value as the season moves along. You mentioned Jamison Williams, Sean, in the last round. I think he would be an amazing pick for us if he would happen to last through, but we are 11 picks away. By ADP now, we are at 132. He usually goes at around 134. So I do think he'll be off the board before it comes back. But some other options, Jamison Crowder. We also would have Jahan Dotson as an option, Robbie Anderson. Anyone, Sean, as you have ticked also players at the top of the queue, Pat Fairmouth and Mike Gesicki as possible second tight end options. Where are we hoping to get this first pick here for us?
Well, if Williams goes, Jahan Dotson is pretty interesting because I like the mix of veterans who are undervalued because they're not enough fun. So players like Tyler Boyd, players like Jamison Crowder, who is just selected right there. But to mix them in with upside plays like Dotson, just the talk of Washington organized team activities, obviously a first-round pick. The Commanders do need some more firepower to offset and to go with Terry McLaurin. And it's also a situation where they had that week 16 game against the 49ers. You talk so much about week 17 and how important it is. The top performers overall are going to make it to week 17 because they get through week 16. So if you have an easy week 16 play that you can make, I like to do that. Now, he was selected. Jamison Williams is still here.
We're going to be heartbroken, Sean, here. We're about to get our hearts shattered. It's going to happen.
Colm thinks he's going to be picked one spot ahead of us. It'll be a little bit tricky if that does go, because I don't think any of the other wide receivers are really justifiable picks.
This drafter is letting the clock tick all the way down. He is by ADP. I hope it's not like an auto pick where we don't get him by ADP. Oh, yes, we get him.
So
the reverse juju has worked.
That's the most excited that Colm has ever been for Albert O going off, not to us.
Pat Crane had a tweet today, Sean. You probably obviously haven't seen it, but he was telling us the correct way to pronounce Albert O's name is Albert Okua Blake Jarwin. So, yeah, we're all on the Dulcich train at this point.
With that being said, is it a good time to select Gerald Everett?
It's always a good time.
So we'll move Everett in there. We get the two. I'm just going to go ahead and call this the 2 elite tight end build, even though Gerald Everett is going outside.
Double elite tight end.
Right.
It's the bully tight end build. But I think, John, after what happened at the start where we shook the draft room to its foundation with the 3 running backs that we got early in the draft, I think going through the roster now with Lance, Fields, our trio of running backs, and Kyle Pitts, Gerald Everett. But now we have Jamison Williams, Garrett Wilson as rookies, Rondell Moore in his second year, Deontay Johnson, DeAndre Hopkins, and then we also have Tyler Boyd in there. So I think it's rounding into shape here. We have lots of time, 15 picks before our next selection. But I think, Sean, we have to be feeling pretty good after the last couple of picks there, because when we got to a situation where I was quite anxious there that we weren't going to end up getting Jamison Williams. I know I talked earlier about DeAndre Hopkins going to miss those games at the start of the season. Possibly Jamison Williams will miss some games with his injury. We'll find out more, but he's another player I think the ADP will skew dramatically in his favor if we start to hear positive reports. But if we had missed out on him, this roster looks considerably different, even with just that one pick. But then we get our second tight end as well, Sean, to play into things. How are you feeling at this point?
Excellent. And one of the things you'll see too when you mess with the Win the Flex tool is that because a handful of the tight ends are just so undervalued, you do have potential scoring opportunity from them late in the draft where you might like that 3 tight end build. I only really recommend the 3 tight end build if you think the third tight end, well, if you don't get the elite tight end to start with, obviously, but then if you think that third tight end is going to be an absolute star. You were joking about the Seahawks-Jets week 17 game. We do have Fant, Wilson that could be the 2 guys who blow up in that game. I'm sure that game is going to be like 55-52, right, Colm?
We are. That is what we are pinning our hopes on, Sean, is that shootout. It's going to be fantastic. It's going to be wonderful. The other thing,
all Fant Wilson.
Yeah, it's going to be, well, I would like to sprinkle in all the players because then all the rosters that we have built have a chance. But yeah, if it has to be, it has to be. But we are we're into fun zone here with this team overall. And Sean, the other game that I was going to mention that we are back on track for, we've got the Bears, we've got the Lions, we've got Fields, and we've got Jamison Williams. So we're stacking up the key games of week 17 again.
And doing it somewhat inexpensively. Right. The whole idea there with Jamison Williams, he goes below ADP. We get a good price on Justin Fields. Obviously, there are a couple of receivers in there that we didn't get great prices on because we wanted to make sure that we got them for the build, but got a good price on Rondell Moore to go with Kyle Pitts. We obviously love him in the 3rd round. Colm, we're moving through round 14. Noah Fant does go off the board. He goes a couple picks after Hayden Hurst, which is kind of interesting. We do still only have the 3 running backs, so we probably are going to want to select at least 1, if not 2 more late. We have Kenny Gainwell in the queue. We also have at wide receiver KJ Hamler, Will Fuller, Julio Jones, Wan'Dale Robinson, David Bell, and Paris Campbell. We're about 5 picks away. What are you thinking for our round 14 selection?
Yeah, I would love to get Gainwell here. The other player that I would have some interest in would be Davis Price. They're probably the running backs, and we're 1 pick away. So we do have an option at both of those. Have you a preference out of those guys? You're into Marlon Mack, Jamal Williams, Mark Ingram then at that point.
Yeah, I have a huge amount of Gainwell, and I think that he has a fantastic chance to be the player who blows up this season. So I would lean that direction. In all likelihood, we're getting a good price on him here. I don't think that we have to take a running back here. There are going to be some guys at the very end. And at the same time, I don't know that we're getting a great price on any receiver at this juncture.
Yeah, I'm waiting to see if we run out of time before that pick goes in. So love the way, eventually we're not going to get one of these players as Shawn plays it out. If for people who are listening to this in the audio form, you can move the player to the top of the queue if you wish, but Shawn continues to leave these players at the bottom. But I think this is a chance here now for us to get a wide receiver like Shawn teased. Are we going for KJ Hamler, Shawn? I know it's a little bit early. Is there anyone else that you want to go for? Do you want to go for Price as well? But I think we should go wide receiver. Oh, we're going in a different direction.
Well, Colm, the top player here by ADP, and I think a fun player to mix in, someone who has been talked about a lot in Indianapolis, somebody who has failed to stay healthy, but really would give them a weapon that offense desperately needs, is Paris Campbell. We're not necessarily trying to play the ADP game once we get into the 170s. That part is a little bit silly. And obviously we want to hit our key receiver targets, especially on this build where we're taking so many of the late guys. And yet I think that was the right play to mix in at this juncture, someone who, because he's been hurt, obviously you can't draft him much ahead of this range, but a healthy season from Paris Campbell would be a huge boon to this particular roster.
Yeah, and that's a player we haven't really discussed at all. So interesting to get him on there as well. Like, should really, if healthy, hopefully it's a big question always with Paris Campbell, but if healthy, I think that at this point of a draft, I think he becomes really valuable. There is times when we're at this point as well, some of those veterans, but he's a veteran who is discounted due to the injury history that he has. Maybe there's obviously risk with the injury, but maybe less risk with him actually having a role in the offense when healthy. And that's going to be important, obviously, with the situation with, I believe, our second wide receiver off the board, DeAndre Hopkins. The key here, Shawn, or the goal would be for Hamler to make it back. But in terms of wide receiver ADP, the only guy ahead of him at the moment is Sammy Watkins. So, but we're in a range here where KJ Hamler's in our queue, Julio Jones in our queue, Wan'Dale Robinson, and Davis Price is still there. So sliding a little bit. But yeah, Davis Price just goes off the board there at that pick. But we are 9 picks away. So there is a chance, Shawn, that some of these guys will slide back to us here. But the one question I had for you based on our build was at running back. We did take Kenny Gainwell there, who I really like. We have the 4 running backs at this point. Do you feel like we're looking at 5 running backs to fill out this build in total? My question around that as well is that Gainwell, and I'm not sure which one of the other running backs, both have a week 7 bye week. Any concerns with 4 running backs, or if we have a crossover on bye weeks as well?
No, not with Jonathan Taylor and Javonte Williams both being available for that week. Now, an injury could happen. One of the things that you're taking the risk on with the hyper fragile is just that you're not going to have that backup at the running back position if injuries happen to you. It's a mixed strategy to where you're going to have to get lucky on the health, and then the rest of the roster completely dominates. The roster construction explorer will tell you that this will work and perhaps work the best with just 4. I think that a lot of it will come down to the last selection. And do we feel comfortable enough about the players we picked at round 16, the beginning there of round 17, how does our wide receiver group look at that point? And then who's the best player available in round 18? Obviously, it's going to be the second to last pick in the draft. I feel comfortable going either way there, but I don't think that we have to force it based on thinking that only 4 running backs will work or only 5 running backs will work.
Okay, no, that sounds good. So at the moment we are at a 2-4-7-2 build. So we have 7 wide receivers. The big advantage of the way we went to quarterback and tight end obviously means that we are freed up for those other shots should we need it. But Sean, we do miss out on KJ Hamler. He goes off the board. At the moment, top of the queue is Julio, then Laviska Shenault, Tyquan Thornton. So we're looking at much later ADP, but Julio is the one that is going in this kind of particular range. Other players, I mentioned Sammy Watkins, Kendrick Bourne, I think there's some interest there. Isaiah McKenzie's going to be in a high-powered offense that's going in this range. But anyone else, Sean, that would stand out to you? You want to get Byron Pringle to pair up with Justin Fields?
No, if we're going to do something like that, let's just take N'Keal Harry in the last round. No, we added Julio. That's absolutely perfect. The devastating selection that did go off just recently there was Wan'Dale Robinson. I really felt like he was going to be the pick that made this hyper-fragile draft work. Obviously, in retrospect, should not have taken Paris Campbell if that was our feeling about that pick. But it does put us back into a situation here where we do have the option of picking Laviska Shenault or Tyquan Thornton, and I don't think you can go wrong picking either one of those players.
Yeah, well, I'm going to let you pick. Thornton will probably last, or let's go Thornton.
So, Colin, you said he was going to last, and then you panicked and said, let's not risk him like we risked Wan'Dale. Tyquan Thornton,
I don't think Tyquan Thornton
should speed.
I don't think he should be lasting, and there's some drafts that I've seen recently where he hasn't lasted to get to that pick, so I thought I would take him. There's other drafts then, Sean, where I've seen him go undrafted, so there is a range of outcomes, but some people I've talked to, like you as well, we're high on him. We want him on our rosters, and I just think you never know which draft room you're in, and when we get into the upside plays here in the 20th round, I don't want to miss out on that, so yeah. The other thing, Sean, when we get to this, we talk sometimes about our guys, and obviously there's going to be people talking about exposures, and we will talk about that as well, but I will lean heavily on the players that I am planning on drafting and that I am currently drafting. And as much, Sean, as maybe we don't want it to be, Laviska Shenault is still one of those guys. So there was a chance also to balance that exposure a little bit.
So we have Laviska at the top of the queue, but the other players that I have now added for the 18-11 are James Robinson, Chris Evans, Sony Michel, Hassan Haskins, Eno Benjamin, Tyler Beatty. We mentioned the sort of dust up about how healthy the Baltimore running backs would be. Tyler Beatty, I think, a guy who is not J.K. Dobbins, but could do a lot of damage if he ends up being the player there with substantial touches, really any part of the season, but someone who could add some firepower early. James Robinson, another play like Jamison Williams and DeAndre Hopkins, where it's probably a playoff play. I don't expect him to be ready, not necessarily to be on the field, but you're going to have that Marlon Mack, Cam Akers kind of dynamic for him in the first half. One of the problems with having that is that the team then loses confidence in the back and doesn't want to play him as much. We discussed on Thursday the very difficult road that later drafted players at all positions, but at running back have to deal with. And if James Robinson comes back and he supposedly is healthy, but this new coaching staff is like, well, we don't see the superstar that this guy was the first couple seasons. Then even when maybe he is ready to play, and that's one of the reasons why I like Marlon Mack as a pick this year, is that even though that Houston Texans offense probably won't score many points, we're now into the time frame where Mack should be back. The reports on him in the offseason workouts have been very good. Marlon Mack was a very good player before he was injured, and now we might see that again. So someone that you would target at the end of drafts. Kind of working my way back through to the point that there's a lot of risk for James Robinson. He probably shouldn't be going where he's going, but in the second to last pick of a draft for someone who was a star. I mean, James Robinson is still a very undervalued, just reality player. If he's your last pick and he's helping you in those final weeks of the season, maybe bridge, get across an injury, that would be interesting. Chris Evans, potential breakout player, and maybe this year's version of Sony Michel. If Joe Mixon were to go down, obviously you're going to score a lot of points in the Bengals offense. Sony Michel could be this year's version of Sony Michel.
That's what I was going to
ask. You have Hassan Haskins, who it'll be interesting to see what happens in training camp. But if he can stay as the clear number 2, then he should probably be going earlier in that Titans offense that has been successfully run heavy even without Derrick Henry. Benjamin probably needs no introduction. Colm, all these guys are still on the board. We're like 3 picks away.
I'm amazed. Dearness Johnson's still on the board. There's just so many options. We have too many options, Sean, for our last pick. Why have these people not been drafted? I really don't mind. I'm happy to draft any of these guys. The ones that I haven't drafted very much is James Robinson because of the injury concerns, and Hassan Haskins I just haven't drafted because he hasn't been there some of the time. So I'm happy to go whichever way you want to lean here. They all fit with bye weeks as well. So,
are you wanting a running back or Laviska?
Let's get Laviska. Let's go Laviska. Let's just go all out. I can't believe it.
So we have all these wonderful running backs.
There was too many running backs. I couldn't decide.
We didn't want to prioritize one over the other, so Colm does give us Laviska Shenault. And Colm, Hyperfragile is where a lot of the fun is at. If you want to draft wide receivers, you get to draft 10 of them if you start with this approach. Take us through our roster. Who do we have on this crazy team?
Yeah, so we have a 10 running back build, or a 10 wide receiver build. So we have Trey Lance and Justin Fields. I think that doesn't really need to be talked about. We're set up pretty perfect there. We have Jonathan Taylor, Javonte Williams, Cam Akers, Kenneth Gainwell. Then it rolls into Deontay Johnson, DeAndre Hopkins, Tyler Boyd, Garrett Wilson, Rondell Moore, Jamison Williams, Paris Campbell, Julio Jones, Taquan Thornton, Laviska Shenault. And again, it's like we talked about Taquan versus Viska in the 19th round, and sometimes it's nice when both of those guys end up being there, but maybe that's because nobody else wants to draft them, but we also get to draft both of them in the same draft. And then we have the double elite tight ends with Kyle Pitts and Gerald Everett set up there as well. 10 wide receivers, Sean. We definitely have lots of options there. 4 running backs. This that was tough at the end trying to decide, because in multiple other drafts at the moment, Sony Michel and Chris Evans out of that group are the ones that I'm really trying to get. A lot of drafts with Chris Evans in it, so it was tough to pass up on him there. But based on what we're trying to do with this build and the amount of resources we put into it in those first 5 rounds, maybe. Would you feel better if this was a 5 running back build or a 4 running back build?
I like it the way that it turned out. It is a good reminder as well, however, how easily you can execute 0 RB in this format if you did go with the wide receivers early instead. I would feel very comfortable selecting the vast majority of those running backs that we had the choice of at the 18-11. Those would be very good picks in round 16, 17, 18. You fill out your 0 RB build with those players. I think you're going to have a lot of excitement down the stretch of your season.
I think that's why I've been, when we look at those names, why I've been drafting so much is because when you get to the 18th, 19th, 20th round, you have your superstar wide receivers and you're trying to fill out your running back depth. So, yeah, seeing them all sitting there, I was like, we should have drafted all these guys.
Yeah, and I think that maybe the pick that we would go back and change, knowing that those players were there. And I mean, Chris Evans is not a player that I've been getting in the last round a lot recently, because so many drafters do understand the extreme upside that he does represent. But if you sort of swap the picks out and you look at our pick there of Gainwell in round 14, that was the round where right after that at the 15:02, we selected Paris Campbell. We would have been able to select both Campbell and Fuller or Campbell and Wan'Dale Robinson if we don't take Gainwell there.
Yeah.
By ADP, it looked like Wan'Dale would come back to us in the 16th round, so we could take Wan'Dale and then Julio Jones, a stronger lineup in a likelihood than Julio and Tyquan Thornton. And yet, at the same time, there's a lot to still happen. I mean, one of the things that has been a little bit odd about this offseason is that given the prices, or I guess it's sort of embedded in my comment about the prices, it's just a lack of enthusiasm for Wan'Dale Robinson and Tyquan Thornton, both players who were drafted early by their teams, who were very clear targets by their teams. Yes, Robinson has maybe a little bit more of a gadget profile than you're looking for, but there's also that Jarvis Landry-ish upside. Yes, Tyquan Thornton may be a little bit more of a pure vertical receiver than what you're looking for, but that's a profile that will work in best ball if it pans out the way that the Patriots believe that it will, if it pans out in the way that they drafted it to work. If you're a believer in Mac Jones and what he did in 2020 at Alabama, where he put up one of the all-time great seasons and led their team to, I don't want to make it sound too easy, but basically an easy national title, and then was the most impressive of the rookie quarterbacks last year, to have a weapon like that added in. And I know that for Thornton especially, there are concerns beyond maybe his usage or his route profile at the NFL level. You have a player who broke out sort of in their fourth season of college. We talk all the time about how those players are likely to underperform ADP. It's one of the reasons why David Bell is a target for us earlier. He was also a guy who went well above ADP in this particular draft, much to our chagrin. But even with that being the case, when you talk about someone who did play well in his final season at Baylor and is drafted as a priority guy ahead of a trio of other intriguing names who went right after him, and the Patriots liked him enough to not only pass on those guys, but to pay extra to do so, you have this chance for him to end up as a DJ Chark, Chase Claypool type of value. Now, obviously, Chark emerged in year 2, not in year 1. Obviously, Claypool has not exactly consolidated his impressive rookie season. And yet, at the same time, we're talking about round 16, round 17, round 18. There are some fun names here. And this is one of the reasons why I would encourage drafters to consider occasionally playing Hyperfragile and to make sure you actually execute it the way that will work. It's a lot of fun. You don't have to draft 0 RB every time. And we picked 10 wide receivers here, Colin. That was a lot of fun.